Good morning. This video is specifically designed to introduce the novels that you'll be choosing from to coincide with the first two units in Semester 2. The novel appears in English, as the reading in the text says, in the late 1600s to the 17th century. The first real novel in English that we'll be taking a look at as an option is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is written by a middle-class author for a middle-class audience and is one of the first books to become a real hit across all classes in England that wasn't a religious text. The Bible had, everybody read the Bible, and everybody read John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but Daniel Defoe's novel was not specifically religious and was the first to break that class barrier. It is an adventure story, very famous one. Robinson Crusoe goes out on an adventure and ends up crashed alone on an island. Eventually we find out that the island is occasionally visited by cannibals, and Robinson has to deal with that in addition to his survival challenge. Daniel Defoe actually based this on a true story, which was typical of the time. Instead of totally making up the story, they would take something that happened to somebody and adapt it or make it more fantastic to create a novel. And the result is Robinson Crusoe, one of the first novels and one of the first true bestsellers in English. The next major period of novel writing that we encounter is the Romantic period. And during just prior to the Romantic period and kind of coinciding with the beginning of it, the Gothic novel became tremendously popular. It was stories about old, creepy castles and over-the-top villains. If you want to think Gothic, think Edgar Allan Poe. In the Romantic era, we have several novelists. The two major novelists, the two most famous nowadays, are Mary Shelley and Jane Austen. And they, of course, wrote very, very different things. Mary Shelley is the direct heir of that Gothic movement, and her first novel and her most famous novel is Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a phenomenal novel. It was written as part of a ghost storytelling competition between Mary Shelley, her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, one of Byron's friends, and the lady that was staying with Byron at the time. They were staying in a castle in Switzerland. Bad weather hit, and they decided they would have a contest to tell ghost stories. And Mary Shelley ended up writing Frankenstein as a result of that. Frankenstein is an incredible novel. It is certainly an heir to the Gothic period. It is certainly one of the very first horror novels ever written. And given the manner of the monster's creation and a mad scientist who is the title character, really it is one of the first science fiction novels. So Mary does something really, really powerful and interesting here. The foreword by another author even says that the scientists of the time who were working with electricity and just discovering its effect on the body and things like that thought that this might be possible at some future time to bring life to a corpse or to a body created artificially from human materials. Shelley does an incredible job of examining her characters and providing psychological depth. She tells a very exciting story, nice and dark, if you like that kind of thing. And she does a number of things with frame stories and epistolary, that is, letter-based writing, that are both typical of the early novel and very different from what we do today. So Frankenstein is also a wonderful choice. Jane Austen, I said, was the other major writer of the Romantic period. And she is the perfect example that when a period starts, we don't suddenly have everyone say, okay, we're all romantics now, let's write the same kind of stuff. Jane Austen writes romantic novels in the sense that we use romantic nowadays. Valentine's Day, romantic love, courtship, etc. Jane Austen was herself, again, as a member of the middling classes. Her family was kind of well-to-do, but not terribly. And she herself never married, although she had at least one proposal that she turned down, which would have been surprising at the time. Marriage, for the people of the late 18th century when Austen was writing, was primarily an economic decision. It wasn't about love. It was about someone you could live with who would provide you with what you needed from a partner. In the woman's case, a safe home and enough food and money to be taken care of, especially after the husband passed. And most marriage decisions were made on this basis. Among the rich, it was even more limited. The younger, poorer classes actually had more freedom to marry because nobody cared who they married. And if nobody has anything, you might as well marry for love because there's no economic advantage to it. But for the middling classes and for the upper classes, it was very restricted. Austen shows an incredible awareness of her own society and how these limits shaped the lives of her heroines. She always has female heroines, and they are always far more independent than society would normally have them be. Each of them gets their happy ending. Austen seemed very dedicated to that, but they have plenty of trouble along the way. Jane Austen also is writing comedies. She is very, very clever and very witty. Whether she is making fun of her heroines for their innocence or ignorance, or whether the heroines themselves are especially witty and clever, she does a wonderful job of bringing humor to the table, and is a fantastic writer. Moving beyond the Romantic period to the Victorian period, when the novel truly comes to be a dominant literary form, we have a whole slew of writers that we will work with. Our transition figure from Romantic to Victorian is Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott is romantic in the sense that he wrote adventure stories, larger than life and embracing the idea of greatness and heroism and principles above practicality, etc. In his use of heroic ideals and lack of focus on heroism, he is actually very different from Jane Austen. The novel that I've chosen to be an option is Ivanhoe, and it reflects the interest of the time in an idealized version of Middle Ages where the knights really did practice chivalry and they really did live according to the codes of honor and things that the Victorians and the Romantics so admired and loved. And Scott would go on to become a master of historical fiction, really the first historical fiction writer in English, and the inventor of historical fiction so far as British literature is concerned. Ivanhoe is a wonderful story of adventure and medieval knighthood. Robin Hood shows up as a character. King Richard shows up as a character. Prince John, or King John, shows up as a character as well. So this is right in that time, and it's that kind of adventure. In addition, we have the Bronte sisters. Each of them has a touch of the Gothic. Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, is especially Gothic. It's the doomed romance with a hero who is both noble but cruel, dark, creepy houses in a dark landscape, a sad, tragic ending. There's even a ghost that shows up, so it's a bit of a Gothic story in that sense as well. It's very much a tale of doomed romance, which is typical of the Gothic genre. Charlotte Bronte, on the other hand, wrote a more realistic coming-of-age novel called Jane Eyre. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte draws from her own time as a student in various boarding schools, including one that was truly awful, and where the mistreatment and lack of good care probably led to the death of her two older sisters. She also talks about her time as a governess and as a student in foreign schools. She uses the marriage plot like Jane Austen does, but she also throws in some Gothicness in that her hero is the hero counterpart to Jane, her main character, her protagonist, is a darker, foreboding man who only opens up to show his soft side eventually, and who has a dark secret that many think is a ghost in his home. And so you have Jane Eyre, which examines the Victorian roles that were open to women and how they dealt with them, and also deals some with the Gothic legacy. The most famous writer of the Victorian period, and of all of these, except perhaps Jane Austen, is Charles Dickens. Dickens is a phenomenal writer. He was very concerned, as is typical of the Victorian period, with the plight of the poor and how the industrial nation created tons and tons of poor living in the city who were paid next to nothing, and even though they had jobs and were working their tails off, were not able to provide for themselves or their families. They ended up owing money, and when you owed money, they sent you to prison or to forced labor houses, things like that. It was very, very difficult. Charles himself was sent to such a house as a young man, and he never really, he was never okay with that. It was something that stuck with him his whole life. This particular novel, Great Expectations, follows the rags to riches pattern of a number of his coming-of-age novels, follows a character named Pip, who starts off pretty poor, and then comes into great expectations. He is provided with a whole bunch of money by a secret donor who helps him out. Dickens provides us with vivid characters, a fantastic picture of what Victorian society was actually like, and is wonderfully humorous as well. He uses comedy to tell his stories. He's not a dark, angry satirist. He doesn't really feel like he's doing satire at all. But his realism is always lightened by humor, optimism, and hope. Great Expectations is a wonderful rags-to-riches coming-of-age story. The last person we have is Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins is one of Dickens's friends. They used to do theater together in their spare time. They were never professionals, but they enjoyed doing it. And Wilkie Collins eventually wrote a number of novels that are the very first English detective stories. He wrote mysteries for the most part, and his most famous is a book called The Moonstone, which is generally considered the first, not mystery, but detective novel in English. Predecessor to Sherlock Holmes, predecessor to all of those. Travels all over the British Empire after a moonstone is stolen, deals with Indian myth and magic and lore, and is the start of the entire detective genre in English literature. He's also one of the first in any English writing, American or British, or really around the world, to write this kind of story. So those are your choices. I'd like you to choose one of those and read it to be finished with these first two units this year.